For 15 years, an army of slaves held off a powerful empire. They captured one of its richest cities. They ran their own government right under its nose. All because of a plant most people have never thought twice about. The same one probably sitting in your kitchen right now. This is the history of sugar, and it starts with a war almost nobody's heard of. Let's dig in. Sugarcane didn't start as sugar. It started as a wild, thick-stalked grass, botanically a cousin of wheat, corn, and bamboo, distinguished mainly by an unusual habit. Instead of using most of the sugar it produces through photosynthesis right away to grow taller or produce fruit, it stores an enormous surplus of it directly inside the fibrous segments of its own stalk, effectively turning each cane into a sealed reservoir of concentrated sweetness. The earliest solid evidence for people deliberately cultivating that plant comes from a place called Cook Swamp in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, where archaeologists have found evidence of drainage and planting systems dating back roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years, making it one of the oldest sites of plant cultivation anywhere on Earth, sugarcane included. People there chewed the raw stalks for a burst of sweetness long before anyone knew how to turn that juice into something solid. From New Guinea, the plant spread two ways. Austronesian seafarers carried cuttings with them as they settled islands across the Pacific over the following millennia, so that by the time European sailors reached Polynesia, cane was already a familiar dooryard plant on islands thousands of miles from where it started. Separately, and much later, it moved west into mainland Southeast Asia and, by around 500 BCE, into India. India is where sugar became sugar in any form we'd recognize today. Indian cultivators worked out how to boil down cane juice and crystallize it into solid granules, a meaningful technological leap in its own right. A liquid you have to drink immediately is a completely different commodity from a solid you can store, weigh, and ship across a continent. The Sanskrit word for that crystallized product was sharkara, and it's the direct ancestor of nearly every word for sugar used today. It became shakar in Persian, sukar in Arabic, sukarum in medieval Latin, and eventually sugar in English. A related Sanskrit word, kanda, meaning a piece or fragment, is where the English word candy comes from. The outside world noticed early. When Alexander the Great's forces reached the Indus Valley in 326 BCE, his admiral, Nearchus, reported back on a strange reed in India that produced, in his words, honey without the help of bees, one of the earliest outside references to sugarcane, describing something the Greeks had no word for yet. To the people who heard about it second-hand afterward, sugar wasn't food. It was a rare, expensive substance imported in tiny quantities, more curiosity than commodity, and for centuries it stayed that way. Sugar's weight in South Asian culture went beyond taste. In classical Indian texts, cane and crystallized sugar turn up repeatedly in religious and ceremonial contexts, offered as symbols of sweetness and prosperity, treated less like a snack and more like a small blessing, worth mentioning in the same breath as other markers of a good life. By the time of the Gupta Empire, roughly the 4th to 6th centuries CE, Indian sugar production had become sophisticated enough to export not raw cane, which by then grew wild or semi-wild across a huge stretch of the tropics anyway, but the refined, granulated product itself, moving west along overland and maritime trade routes toward Persia. That refined, storable, tradable form is the version of sugar the rest of the world would eventually inherit. What traveled west wasn't just the crop either. Growing sugarcane at scale outside its native tropical range takes serious irrigation engineering, since cane is thirsty enough that it can drain a poorly managed water system dry within a single growing season. And the agricultural knowledge needed to manage that — canal networks, water lifting devices, planting cycles matched to flood patterns — moved west across Persia, right alongside the plant itself. And the first place that combination of crop and irrigation science turned outright brutal wasn't the Caribbean 800 years later. It was Iraq. By the 7th century, sugarcane cultivation had spread from India into Persia, and when the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate rose to power in the mid-700s, it inherited both the crop and the irrigation expertise to grow it at scale. The Abbasids controlled an enormous territory, stretching from North Africa to Central Asia, and Iraq's southern marshlands along the lower Tigris and Euphrates near Basra became one of the empire's major agricultural zones. There was a problem with that land. Centuries of irrigation and evaporation had left the soil crusted with salt and nitrous deposits, unusable for planting until it was physically stripped away, layer by hand, before richer soil underneath could be reached and sown. It was an enormous reclamation project. Entire estates' worth of marshland cleared by manual labor before a single stalk of cane went into the ground. And it required exactly the kind of large, expendable, and continuously replenished workforce that a purely free labor market of the era was never going to supply. The Abbasids solved that labor problem the way most large agricultural empires of the era did, with enslaved workers. In this case, brought in enormous numbers from the East African coast. Arabic sources of the period referred to this broad region and to the enslaved laborers taken from it as Zanj. Conditions on these estates were severe, even by the standards of the time. Workers were housed in large labor camps, sometimes thousands to a single plantation, digging out toxic soil under brutal heat, with little control over their own labor or movement. In 869 CE, a rebellion broke out under a man named Ali ibn Muhammad, who organized the enslaved plantation workers, along with some free laborers and soldiers who joined the cause, into an organized armed force. What started as a local uprising grew into a sustained war against the caliphate. The rebels captured Basra itself in 871 and for a period controlled a substantial stretch of southern Iraq, effectively running their own territory outside Abbasid control, complete with its own administration and coinage. The Zanj Rebellion lasted until 883 CE, nearly 15 years, before an Abbasid army under Caliph al-Muwaffaq finally laid siege to the rebels' fortified capital and crushed the uprising. Estimates of the total death toll from the fighting, the sieges, and the destruction of Basra itself run into the hundreds of thousands, and historians consider it one of the largest slave revolts in recorded history. Even the man who led it remains a puzzle historians haven't settled. Ali ibn Muhammad wasn't a slave, and he wasn't from the marshlands he organized. Some medieval chroniclers describe him as Persian. Others record an Arab lineage, claiming descent from the fourth Caliph Ali and from the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima, a claim that at least one contemporary historian openly doubted. What he believed is disputed too. He aligned himself with an early Islamic sect that held leadership should rest on piety and conviction rather than birth or race, giving him religious grounds to argue that enslaved Africans deserved to lead, whatever his own private motives were. Whether Ali ibn Muhammad was a sincere revolutionary or an opportunist who found the perfect army for his own ambitions is a question historians still argue about, and the honest answer is that both could be true at once. For a caliphate at the height of its power, the revolt he led was a close call, one that some historians argue contributed to the long, slow fragmentation of Abbasid central authority in the decades that followed. It's also a story that almost never appears in popular sugar history content, despite predating the plantation systems of the Caribbean by roughly 800 years, and despite sugar cultivation being the direct economic cause of the labor system that provoked it. While Iraq's sugar industry was being fought over, Europe barely had sugar at all. The first Europeans to encounter it in any quantity were crusaders in the Levant, where captured sugar mills near Tripoli and on Cyprus gave them a direct look at cane cultivation for the first time. Operations that, like their counterparts in Iraq, ran on a mix of local and enslaved labor. Some of those crusader-controlled estates continued producing sugar for European export for generations after the Crusades themselves ended. By the 13th century, Venice had positioned itself as Europe's dominant sugar broker, buying refined sugar from Egyptian and Levantine producers and reselling it at an enormous markup to every other European court. At those prices, sugar wasn't food. It was closer to a jewel. One of the earliest recorded royal purchases in England came from Henry III, who, in the 13th century, placed an order for 3 pounds of sugar. And the wording of the request, asking for that much, if so much is to be had, makes clear that even a royal household couldn't simply buy sugar on demand. By some estimates, that same 3 pounds might have represented close to the entire sugar supply available in the kingdom at that moment. Because it was rare and shockingly expensive, European royalty didn't just eat sugar, they displayed it. Wealthy households commissioned elaborate sculptures made entirely from molded sugar paste, known as subtleties, presented as centerpieces between courses at state banquets. Records from 15th century Italian court feasts describe subtleties depicting entire hunting scenes, coats of arms, and mythological figures, built by teams of confectioners using carved wooden molds. Some reached heights of 6 feet. They were sometimes eaten afterward, but their true function was closer to a modern luxury car parked in a driveway. Proof that a household could afford to destroy an obscene quantity of the world's most expensive substance purely for show. Producing those sculptures required serious specialized skill, and by the 15th century, master confectioners in Italian and French courts trained apprentices for years to learn sugar work alone, a distinct craft separate from ordinary cooking, with its own techniques for pulling, molding, and coloring sugar paste that wouldn't look out of place in a modern pastry kitchen. That's the entire mechanism by which sugar spread through medieval Europe. Not force, not compulsion, but pure status competition among people who could afford to waste it. It's a strikingly different story from what was happening in Iraq only a few centuries earlier. And it's the second of sugar's 2 founding stories, one built on enslaved labor, the other built on aristocratic vanity. Sugar's next transformation happened an ocean away. Christopher Columbus carried sugarcane cuttings to the Caribbean on his second voyage in 1493, and within decades, Portuguese colonists had established the first large-scale sugar plantations in the Americas, in Brazil, running on enslaved African labor from the very start. The English colony of Barbados marked the real turning point. Settled in the 1620s as a tobacco colony, Barbados switched almost entirely to sugar by the 1640s, in what historians now call the Sugar Revolution, a rapid, total conversion of an island's economy, land use and population toward a single cash crop, powered by imported enslaved labor on a scale the colony had never seen before. The technology driving that shift was the three-roller cane mill, which let planters crush far more cane far faster than earlier single-roller designs, feeding a boiling house process that reduced the raw juice down to shippable sugar, and, as a byproduct, the molasses that would later be distilled into rum. By the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, had become the single most profitable colony on Earth, producing, by some estimates, around 40% of all the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in Europe. A colony smaller than the state of Maryland was generating more revenue for its parent empire than most entire nations. That wealth was built entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans, transported across the Atlantic in numbers that dwarfed the earlier Iraqi plantation system by an order of magnitude. Historians estimate roughly 12 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas over the full span of the trade, a substantial portion of them destined specifically for sugar cultivation. Sugar didn't just make individual planters rich. It restructured the economics of entire nations, and every European power with a Caribbean foothold built its own version of the same machine. British Jamaica, French Saint-Domingue, Spanish Cuba, and Dutch Suriname each developed sugar economies large enough to dominate that empire's colonial trade on their own. And each depended on continuous, large-scale importation of enslaved Africans to replace workers who died faster than they could be replaced by birth. A grim arithmetic unique to the intensity of sugar labor compared to almost any other colonial crop. Britain's sugar imports from the Caribbean became so central to its economy that protecting those colonies shaped naval strategy, war planning, and diplomatic priorities for well over a century. The crop that Henry III once ordered 3 pounds of at a time had become, within 500 years, the single largest driver of transatlantic trade in the Western world. The end of slavery didn't end sugar's labor problem. Britain formally abolished slavery across its empire between 1833 and 1838, and France followed in 1848. Plantation owners across the Caribbean suddenly faced a labor shortage on an industry they had spent 2 centuries building around unpaid, coerced work. And they replaced it with a new system: indentured servitude, drawing overwhelmingly on labourers from British India. Under what came to be called the Gurmit system, named for a local mispronunciation of the English word agreement, Indian workers signed multi-year contracts to labour on Caribbean sugar estates in exchange for passage, wages, and the promise of return transport once the contract ended. Recruitment often relied on local agents called arkatis, who worked on commission and were notorious for misleading rural villagers about the distance, duration, and nature of the work waiting for them overseas. The voyage itself could take months and carried real mortality risk from disease in crowded ship holds. The first ship to carry indentured labourers under the new system, a vessel called the Fatel Razak, arrived in Trinidad in 1845, carrying 225 workers from Calcutta. A single voyage that opened 7 decades of continuous labour migration along the same route. Between 1838 and 1917, roughly 500,000 Indian indentured laborers were transported specifically to Caribbean colonies, including Trinidad, British Guiana, and Suriname, out of well over 1 million transported under similar schemes empire-wide, including tens of thousands more sent as far as Fiji on the other side of the planet, where Indian indentured workers on sugar estates would eventually make up such a large share of the population that Fiji today still counts descendants of that migration as roughly a third of its national population, echoing almost exactly what happened in the Caribbean on the opposite side of the globe. In practice, indenture often reproduced the conditions it was meant to replace. Contracts were frequently extended through debt, wages, and legal penalties designed to keep workers on the estate. Living and working conditions on many plantations remained harsh, and the promised return passage was, for a large share of workers, never actually provided. The system wasn't legally slavery, but many historians studying it have concluded that the day-to-day experience for a great many indentured laborers looked very close to it. The Caribbean wasn't the only destination. Starting in 1860, the British colony of Natal, in what's now South Africa, imported its own large indentured workforce from India, specifically to staff its sugar plantations. And it was in Natal, decades later, that a young Indian lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi first built his legal career, representing that same indentured community, an experience that shaped the political tactics he'd later bring back to India. The system didn't end on its own. It took that kind of sustained organizing, alongside later lobbying in India by the missionary and activist C.F. Andrews, to finally force the British government to abolish new indentured emigration altogether in 1917. The legacy of the decades before that reform is still visible today, and not only in the paperwork. Trinidad and Guyana both have populations of Indian descent, making up close to 40% of their national population, and both countries mark an official Indian Arrival Day. Musical and culinary traditions descended from those original laborers, from chutney music to curry-based Caribbean dishes, remain a living part of the culture, a direct cultural inheritance from a 19th century labor solution to a crop that had already, once before, provoked one of history's largest slave revolts. Most sugar histories treat the Arab world purely as a relay station, the middlemen who moved sugar from India to Europe. That undersells what actually happened in the Middle East itself, where sugar became the foundation of an entire confectionery tradition that predates European sweets by centuries, producing an entire family of sugar and nut pastries, from halva to baklava, that developed their own regional identities and their own local variations, city by city, long before anything comparable existed in most of Europe. Each of those sweets carries its own local dialect of the same basic grammar, dense semolina or nut fillings bound with sugar syrup instead of the fresh dairy that dominated European desserts of the same era. A difference rooted directly in which ingredient happened to be locally abundant and which happened to be a rare, imported luxury. One of the clearest surviving threads from that tradition is mamul, a semolina pastry shaped by hand or pressed into a carved wooden mold, stuffed with dates, walnuts or pistachios, and dusted with powdered sugar. Its lineage traces back to older Mesopotamian stuffed cake traditions, the same broad region where sugar cultivation had taken root centuries earlier. And the carved wooden molds used to shape it, called tabi, are themselves a craft tradition passed down through families of woodworkers for generations. Mamul's staying power is part of what makes it deserve to be told on its own terms, rather than as an afterthought. It's baked across the Levant for Eid al-Fitr in Muslim households and for Easter in Christian households, often using the same carved molds and the same family recipes, passed down regardless of which holiday is being marked that year. It's one of the rare foods in the region that functions as a genuine point of shared culture across religious lines, a far cry from the usual traders passing sugar westward framing, and something that rarely makes it into English-language food history content. The Middle East absorbed sugar through open trade. On the opposite end of the story is Japan, which got its own sugar tradition precisely because trade was cut off. Through most of the Edo period, starting in 1603, Japan operated under a strict isolationist policy that sharply limited foreign trade, which meant imported sugar was scarce and expensive. In the early 18th century, the shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune, concerned about that dependency, began offering stipends to any feudal domain willing to attempt growing sugarcane domestically. Two regions on the island of Shikoku, present-day Tokushima and Kagawa, took him up on it, cultivating a thin, hardy cane variety suited to the local climate, known as chikuto. What they came up with wasn't just a local substitute for imported sugar, it was something else entirely. Farmers developed a laborious hand-refining method, kneading and pressing the crystallized sugar through cloth and wooden trays multiple times, entirely without the industrial rollers and centrifuges that were transforming sugar refineries in Europe and the Caribbean at almost exactly the same moment. The result, known as wasanbon, is a pale, extremely fine-grained sugar with a delicate, almost floral flavor, still made by only a small number of producers in those same two prefectures today. It was originally reserved almost exclusively for the aristocracy and the samurai class, prized above all as the defining ingredient in wagashi, the elaborate traditional sweets served alongside tea ceremonies, often molded by hand into seasonal shapes: cherry blossoms in spring, maple leaves in autumn. It's a strange mirror image of everything else in this story. Everywhere else, sugar spread because empires opened trade routes and moved enslaved labor across oceans to meet demand. In Japan, it took a government deliberately closing its borders to force an entirely independent, handcrafted refining tradition into existence. One that survives today for the same reason it started. Because, for 2 centuries, there was no easier way to get it. Here's something that tends to surprise people. For most of its early history, sugar wasn't eaten, exactly. It was prescribed. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, included sugar-based syrups among the remedies detailed in his 11th century medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, prescribing them for coughs, digestive complaints, and as a base to make other medicines more palatable. That medical framing carried into medieval Europe through a compounded remedy called theriac, a multi-ingredient cure-all, sometimes containing dozens of components, that European apothecaries prepared with sugar and honey as a base and sold as a genuine pharmaceutical product for centuries. In fact, Venice treacle, a particularly famous version of theriac, was one of Venice's most valuable exports alongside sugar itself, sold by weight in specific doses for specific conditions, right alongside other compounded remedies. It took centuries for sugar to fully make the jump from medicine cabinet to dinner table. For a very long stretch of human history, if you wanted something sweet and you weren't royalty, your doctor was a more likely source than your kitchen. That overlap even left a mark on the language. Apothecaries routinely coated bitter, unpleasant compounds in a shell of sugar to make them tolerable to swallow. A literal practice that's the direct origin of the phrase sugar the pill. Ask 3 different historians who invented sugar as we know it, and you'll likely get 3 different answers. And all 3 have a real claim. The case for India rests on the crystallization process itself. Indian producers were the first to figure out how to turn cane juice into a storable solid, sometime before 350 BCE. And that single innovation is what made sugar a tradable commodity at all, rather than a local snack. The case for the Arab world rests on refining and scaling. Abbasid-era producers developed improved techniques for purifying and whitening raw sugar into the dense, cone-shaped loaf form that dominated trade for the next 1,000 years. And Arab agricultural science was responsible for spreading cane cultivation to new climates across the Mediterranean and beyond. The case for Europe rests on industrialization. Vacuum pan evaporation, the technique that made large-scale refining practical, worked by boiling cane juice under reduced air pressure, which let it reach a full boil at a much lower temperature and stopped the sugar from scorching or caramelizing before it had fully crystallized, dramatically increasing both the yield and the purity of the final product compared to older open kettle methods. And here, the most striking name is Norbert Rillieux, who in 1843 patented the multiple effect evaporator, a system that dramatically cut the fuel and labor needed to refine sugar and became the industry standard still echoed in refineries today. Rillieux was a free man of color, born in New Orleans, educated in Paris, who returned to Louisiana to build his invention in a sugar industry built entirely on enslaved plantation labor, only to find himself barred by Louisiana's escalating racial laws from fully enjoying the professional standing his invention had earned him. He eventually left the United States for France for good, a footnote that rarely makes it into the story, even when the invention itself does. His evaporator was adopted so widely, first across Louisiana's own refineries and then internationally, that by the end of the 19th century, it's estimated a majority of the world's sugar was being refined using some version of the system he designed, making him, by that measure, one of the most consequential and least credited figures in the entire industry. Even the smaller conveniences have their own disputed inventors. The individually wrapped sugar cube, ubiquitous today, is generally credited to Jakob Christoph Rand, manager of a sugar refinery in what's now the Czech Republic, who patented a cube-cutting device in 1843, reportedly after his wife cut her fingers repeatedly trying to chip pieces off a solid sugar loaf. None of these claims cancels out the others. Each one solved a different problem at a different stage. How to make sugar solid, how to make it pure, and how to make it fast, cheap, and convenient at scale. Presented as a competition, it's an argument. Presented honestly, it's several distinctly separate breakthroughs, spanning 2,000 years and 4 continents. And the fact that most popular retellings credit only one of those 3 civilizations says more about who's been doing the retelling than about who actually did the work. By the early 1800s, sugar production was shifting again, this time driven by politics rather than taste. Napoleon's continental blockade during the wars with Britain cut off French access to Caribbean cane sugar, and in response, French chemists accelerated the extraction of sugar from an entirely different plant, the sugar beet. Beet sugar production expanded rapidly across continental Europe over the following decades, permanently breaking cane sugar's monopoly on the world's sweetener supply. America's biggest 20th century sugar disruption had a similarly political origin. After the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the United States severed trade ties with Cuba, at the time one of the largest cane sugar exporters in the world, and tightened import quotas on sugar more broadly through the 1960s. That made cane sugar more expensive and less reliably available to American food manufacturers, at exactly the moment new chemistry made an alternative viable. Chemists Richard Marshall and Earl Coey had identified an enzyme in 1957 that could convert cornstarch into a sweet, fructose-rich syrup, and Japanese researcher Yoshiyuki Takasaki refined that process into an industrial method through the mid-1960s. By the early 1970s, high-fructose corn syrup was being commercialized at scale in the United States, priced advantageously in part because of domestic corn subsidies, and those same sugar import restrictions working together. American per capita consumption of the syrup went from close to nothing in 1970 to overtaking cane and beet sugar combined within about 15 years. Not because it tasted better, but because trade policy had made it the cheaper option. That's a meaningfully different story from an industry conspired to make people fat, even though that's often how it gets told. The real sequence is a mix of Cold War trade politics, domestic agricultural subsidy, and enzyme chemistry lining up at the same moment. A policy story wearing a food history costume. Sugar had already proven itself a strategic commodity once before, during the Second World War. Both Britain and the United States imposed strict sugar rationing almost as soon as they entered the war, since shipping capacity that would otherwise carry sugar was needed for troops and munitions, and much of the world's sugar-growing regions were suddenly cut off by naval blockades or occupied territory. British rationing, introduced in 1940, limited each person to roughly half a pound of sugar a week, enforced through ration books and coupons, and it didn't fully end until 1953, 8 years after the war itself was over. In the United States, sugar was the first food rationed after Pearl Harbor, and the last one to come off the ration list. A small but telling sign of just how strained global sugar supply chains had become the moment a handful of major producing regions went offline at once. The refining side of the industry consolidated just as fast. In Britain, two rival refiners, Henry Tate and Abram Lyle, built competing sugar empires in the late 19th century, before eventually merging in 1921 to form Tate and Lyle, a company still operating today, and still selling the golden syrup Lyle's factory started producing as a byproduct of the refining process back in the 1880s. It's a reminder that behind every generic bag of sugar sitting in a supermarket aisle is a specific corporate lineage stretching back well over a century, built on the same refining innovations and often the same colonial supply chains that this entire story has been tracing from the start. Sugar's labor problem never fully went away. It just changed shape again. Reports from labor and human rights organizations in recent decades, including investigations by Verite and the International Labour Organization, have continued to document exploitative conditions in parts of the global sugar supply chain, including cases of child labor and debt-bound labor on cane farms in parts of South Asia and Central America. The mechanism is depressingly familiar. Workers borrow money from a labor recruiter or estate owner to cover travel or basic living costs, then find the debt structured through inflated interest or deliberately low wages so that it never actually gets paid off, keeping them tied to the same farm for years. A modern echo of exactly the kind of contract manipulation that trapped many 19th century indentured laborers in the first place. The response, still ongoing, has been a wave of ethical certification schemes. Fairtrade International began certifying sugar in the 1990s. auditing supply chains and guaranteeing minimum prices and labor standards in exchange for a certification label consumers can look for on a bag or a bar of chocolate. A newer standard called Bon Sucro launched in 2011 and focused specifically on sugarcane, takes a broader approach, certifying entire mills and farming regions against labor and environmental benchmarks rather than individual retail products. By the early 2020s, certified sugar under these combined schemes still covered only a modest share of global production, and researchers and journalists have raised real questions about how consistently standards get enforced on the ground. But together, they represent something the marsh workers outside Basra never had, and the indentured laborers on 19th century Caribbean estates never had either. An actual, if incomplete, mechanism for consumers on the other side of the world to ask where their sugar came from, and to have that question answered. It's a strange kind of progress. A product that once required its own royal decree just to be purchased at all, now requires its own auditing agency just to be purchased responsibly. And both facts are true of the exact same crop. There's one more modern thread to pull on, and it's less about policy and more about biology. Research into how sugar affects the brain has found that eating it triggers a release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the same reward circuitry activated by a wide range of pleasurable experiences. Some researchers, including neuroscientist Nicole Avena, have run experiments showing that rats given intermittent access to sugar display behavioral and neurochemical changes, binging, withdrawal-like symptoms, and increased sensitivity to other rewarding substances that resemble patterns seen with substances of abuse. Whether that adds up to sugar being truly addictive in the same clinical sense as a drug is a live, ongoing scientific debate, not a settled fact. Most researchers in the field are careful to distinguish between a food that strongly activates reward pathways and a substance that meets the full clinical criteria for addiction. And plenty of the same debate maps onto other highly palatable foods generally, not sugar specifically. What does seem clear is that this reward response isn't a modern malfunction. It's an ancient piece of wiring, built at a time when a calorie-dense, easy-to-digest source of energy was rare enough that craving it on sight was a survival advantage, not a flaw. Sugar didn't have to hijack anything. It walked straight through a door the human brain had left open for it, long before anyone figured out how to crystallize it. A rebellion in a 9th century Iraqi marsh, led by a man whose own identity nobody's ever fully settled. An aristocrat's sugar sculpture. An Indian laborer's contract 3 continents from home, ended only through a young Gandhi's early activism. A pastry shared between 2 religions. An island nation that built an entire handcrafted sugar tradition precisely because it had sealed its own borders shut. An inventor written out of his own success story because of the color of his skin. A reward circuit in the human brain that never needed convincing in the first place. None of it looks like it belongs in the same story as the bag of sugar in your kitchen cabinet. But it's all the same crop, and it's all the same thread. Something people were willing to enslave each other over, worship, isolate themselves to recreate, industrialize, and eventually feel guilty about, generation after generation, for 8,000 years. Almost none of it required sugar to be scarce either. Long after it stopped being rare, the crop kept generating new reasons for people to fight over how it got made, who made it, and who profited. Which is a very different kind of history than the story of a spice that was simply prized and then, eventually, just became affordable. The rebellion in that Iraqi marsh didn't win, but the crop it was fought over never stopped spreading. And it's still shaping labor, trade policy, and what's sitting in your pantry today. If you didn't see that coming, hit subscribe. There's more forgotten history where that came from.